Rue Valley begins in a small, almost unassuming way, introducing you to Mr. Harrow, a man caught in what at first seems like an ordinary day at a desert motel. You're attending a therapy session, you wander around the motel grounds, and ultimately your goal appears to be just to find a room where you can relax. But when the day ends, you wake up right back where you started, and the realization hits you. Mr. Harrow is trapped. He's in a 47-minute time loop, which you need to find a way out of. If you played the demo, which is available on Steam, you'll know that what we've seen of the game so far is a pretty small, contained tutorial of sorts, explaining the game's core mechanics. You learn about the personality-driven skill system, the conditions you can find yourself in, such as the seemingly permanent total lack of motivation or the soggy sock, and some early signs that certain actions are going to be available or not, depending on who your Mr. Harrow is. Emotion Spark attended Gamescom this year and were kind enough to show me a new version of the build, where we were able to explore much more of what Rue Valley has to offer. Instead of being confined to the motel, we were shown some new systems and locations that highlight how Rue Valley expands on the loop, layering choice, personality and memory into a complex web of cause and effect. First of all then, let's just have a brief reminder of what we do know about Rue Valley, with some focus on the personality system which holds the game together. So during your character creation, you are able to distribute points amongst a variety of traits, cognitive, social and emotional tracks that shape dialogue and the options that they give you in the game. The system seems designed, from my perspective, to stop players doing any kind of RPG min-maxing. Every strength carries a weakness. If you think being extremely calculated will mean you're a genius, well, actually it's just as likely to mean that you're too indecisive. What's really neat for me in the character build is that I found myself thinking much more about who I am rather than who I want Mr. Harrow to be. You are not always locked to these traits, however. You can also experience temporary shifts in your personality through status effects and contextual events in the game's story. An introvert, for instance, might find themselves to be more outgoing after a drink of some alcohol gives them a dose of Dutch courage. Other systems add further texture. Conditions like total lack of motivation completely block certain actions until addressed, or for example, if you're thirsty, it can make Mr. Harrow more impulsive. It aims to reflect how our own psychology can change depending on how much stress we're under or what is driving us forward at any given time. And what does drive Mr. Harrow exactly? Well, naturally, like anyone trapped in a time loop, there is a certain desire to escape it, and that is the main motivation behind everything we'll be doing in the game, or at least as far as we know. This is where the mind map comes in. The mind map serves as a sort of journal. Whilst the loop repeats each day, Mr. Harrow is able to retain all of the information he gathers within his mind map, a place full of ideas, reasons and motivations based on what you've discovered and the options for what to do next. Given this game is a narrative RPG and has some focus on psychology, it's tempting to compare Rue Valley to Disco Elysium. They both demand players take time to explore, spend a good amount of time reading, and although Mr. Harrow isn't a detective, clearly he is some sort of amateur PI trying to investigate his own situation, similar to, say, George Stobart from Broken Sword. There are many areas, in fact, that we can point and say it's just like Disco Elysium. In fact, Emotion Spark have made no secret of how much that game has inspired them. But there are some key differences here which I think are worth highlighting. My experience with the game so far in terms of narrative punch, for example, lead me to believe that Disco Elysium could be more accurately described as a sort of serious novel penned by an ultra-political author with something poignant to say about the world. Rue Valley, for me, aims to be something more akin to a graphic novel. It has a little bit more whimsy, takes a more relaxed approach to its messaging, and puts charm at the forefront. There are very deliberate design choices too to lean into that comic book style, such as the page turning of the dialogue screen, the comic style text boxes and effects, plus the overall art style was actually inspired by the Spider-Verse movies, which are also taking a lot of inspiration from traditional comic books. So whilst you perhaps could harshly criticise Rue Valley for being just another narrative cRPG trying to ride on the coattails of Disco Elysium, I think it has enough creativity and individuality here that is certain to stand on its own terms. Not least because I believe it has an ace up its sleeve, a core mechanic which I think will allow Rue Valley to break free of comparison and be loved for trying to advance the genre further in its own unique way. That is, of course, the time loop. Your primary goal appears to be, on the face of it, obtaining as much knowledge on Rue Valley and its inhabitants as you can to eventually execute a perfect series of events within the 47-minute time loop, which will solve the mystery of why you're in Rue Valley in the first place and how to escape this godforsaken place. So what gives me so much reason for excitement and making bold statements like it will stand on its own 2 feet? Well, let's talk a little bit about what was shown at Gamescom. Firstly, almost all of the presentation took place outside of the familiar motel area. Immediately we were taken to Mr. Harrow's car, a new feature which has not been seen yet, and he can use that to travel around Rue Valley much quicker. Disadvantage is one I expect to be revealed fairly early in the game, as it serves to tackle the time restraints in a way that only a motor vehicle can. However, it is not going to solve every problem. To add some context here, it's important to highlight that your 47 minutes is always counting down in the top right hand of your screen. When Mr. Harrow used his car to travel to a new area, we found him to be in what's described as a live loading screen, and that clock was still ticking. We eventually then arrive at our destination, or the earliest point in our destination that we can reach, which is a roadblock. We were aiming to get to a bar area up in the mountains and arrived at a roadblock, which then means that we have to get out on foot. So it's clear from the outset that although you will be empowered by certain aspects of the game, you can also find that they have their own limitations further down the line. Limitations that I actually expect you can remove as you discover more of the game. So as Mr. Harrow sets out on foot, we saw him journey alongside a mountainside road where we came across a new area with a bar. The bar interior was not shown, but it has been used many times in the Rue Valley social media posts, so it'll be no stranger to eyes of the fans. We also saw a new character stood outside the bar. The best way I can describe her is a sort of high-class lady of a certain era. We didn't speak to this lady, but at this point Marco did say that it's worth noting that depending on someone's mood or the context, they may not be there at a certain time, or their disposition is going to be slightly different. As the presentation moved on, we also saw a new area called the Ranch, and it was here we had a little bit more detail explained to us in how Mr. Harrow formulates tasks. Whilst the mind map serves to gather and collect your various memories and ideas, it is up to the player to actually formulate them in the first place. For reasons unknown, Mr. Harrow needs to get access to this ranch. Now, as a player, you can have that desire within you, but our protagonist needs much more motivation than the puppeteer's curiosity. Initially interacting with the door doesn't really present you too many options, but Marco then loaded into a different save where Mr. Harrow had gathered enough information that he had valid reasons to gain access to the ranch, and as such, more options became available. It's a neat way of preventing players cheesing the game through guides and encouraging those to experiment with the world and discover these new avenues for themselves. Additionally, of course, the different approaches you can take to gaining access will depend on the personality of your own Mr. Harrow. So one might be more inclined to break in, whilst another would favour talking to the residents and convincing them to let them in. This makes use of the time loop and the mind map even more important. As I stated, the information you gain is permanently locked in. You have everything that you learn through each time loop locked away in your mind map, and you can use that to your advantage as you go into each new loop. This is important because each NPC and area in Rue Valley will have an altered state depending on context, mood, and what you've done already. Let's take another example. You'll be familiar by now, if you've played the demo, with an angry lady hitting the vending machine outside of the motel. Well, we were shown exactly how managing your information in the context of the time loop can completely change what you have access to. In the presentation, we approached the vending machine at a later point in the loop, where the machine is unattended. Upon inspection, we tried to buy a drink, only to discover it doesn't work. This then gives us a reason to start inquiring about the broken vending machine and opens up dialogue with the hotel receptionist. Here, she can then tell you exactly how to fix it, and once you complete the task, it's now safely stored away in your mind map for the next loop. Cue the next morning, and you now have the opportunity to help that lady out first thing. This will alter her mood. She'll be much happier because she's got a coffee and is no longer frustrated by the machine, and her disposition will change, and she will also move on to a new area sooner than she might have done before. This idea of carefully plotting around characters and information in the world reminds me a little bit of Deathloop. With each time you progress, you discover more about the patterns of its inhabitants until you eventually work out that perfect formula to complete every task within the designated time frame. To apply this kind of mechanic to a narrative RPG is, for me, a truly fascinating idea. To demand players pay attention to the wants and needs of the NPCs, and then to decide to assist or take advantage of them, provides players with moral stakes which are often much more black and white in the genre. It fascinates me that we will need to consider what works for the personalities of the people we meet, just as much as we need to consider those for our protagonist. What advantage can paranoia give us? When are we going to regret being so impulsive? Questions we all certainly ask of ourselves in life, now being asked of you in a virtual one. I have had the pleasure of talking and thinking about Rue Valley for a number of months now, and whilst it brings me immense joy to see this game take much of its inspiration from Disco Elysium, I'm more than encouraged by the creativity found in this game that I have every confidence it will be loved for being so much more than that. Interestingly, its release of 11th November this year means that it will actually be the first major title from the growing list of new narrative-driven cRPGs, so there's a level of pressure on the team at Emotion Spark to pave the way for all of the others. And from what I've seen so far, the path carved out in Rue Valley will be one that gives us our first big positive steps in the direction beyond Elysium.